Thank you so much, and welcome to another episode of the Innovation Foundation for Democracy. Today, we're joined by Mpilo Cele, who is the chair of the South African Youth Association of Global Affairs. He also recently completed his master's in economics at WITS. So, Mpilo, thank you and welcome. This has been long coming, so it's good to finally have you.
No, thank you so much, Samukelo, and greetings to your viewers.
Yeah. So I want to open this because of course, like I also would like to hear what SAYAGA does and the position that you're trying to the input or the intervention that you're trying to bring into global affairs, into democracy, but also into the whole multilateral system and how we can think about it. But you also serve in a lot of these also institutions. The World Economic Forum, the youth chapter of that, and these all others. So I don't know. I want to open with some reflection from you, particularly on where the state of the multilateral system right now.
Yeah. It's a very broad question, but just to reflect on one simple thing. It is crumbling. We are at a stage now where we are seeing multilateralism being challenged, and it is unfortunate that it's being challenged by the same forces, that brought up this multilateral system post-war in 1945. Because you must remember that there were institutions which were built, for example, after World War I, which is like the League of Nations. After that, you have the United Nations, after the League of Nations fails. And so after World War II, you have these United Nations with all its other institutions, and other also multilateral organizations that accompanies it, in order to bring peace in the world. So, for example, if you can think from the trade perspective, you can think of the World Trade Organization. You think from the health perspective, you think of the WHO. You think from the international law, you think about the role of the ICJ and the ICC, in adjudicating cases and also pursuing those who commit war crimes. From all aspects, you can see that actually from all these fronts, I can actually count events whereby we failed to hold leaders accountable. So, for example, let's think about WHO. We know that in 2019, we had a pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And what the WHO really emphasizes is this global governance of global health, whereby we are going to be able to share resources as well as intellectual knowledge in terms of what are the best medicines that we can actually produce. But what we saw coming from the global north, during that pandemic, at a time of a crisis whereby the people are dying in millions and millions of people, we saw countries developing vaccines, but they held this intellectual property rights, which is still a very huge thing. So now you think about profits, even at a time whereby the world is actually faced, with this disease whereby it's really killing a lot of people. So you can see the shortcoming then of global solidarity when it came to global health. You can think about WTO, for example, in this current moment, whereby we saw the application of universal tariffs, by the United States of America, throughout all over the world, and obviously the methodology, has been questioned a lot in terms of calculating those tariffs. It has been questioned a lot. So you see also the economic power being used, the economic might being used actually, to coerce states to actually agree to certain positions, or if you don't do that, and then this is what is going to happen to you. So you can say that it is in a crisis, but it is a moment also. I don't look at it as just as a crisis, but it is a moment, and especially as Africans, I think it is a moment to actually think, about all these ideas that we've been having, all these institutions we've been building, to say, in this disorder that we are actually facing, what exactly is the future that we want to see in the crumbling of these multilateral institutions? And what I can reflect on is that we've seen the African countries taking different approaches into this. So, for example, inside the continent, there's appetite for intra-African trade. There's an appetite for solidarity within the African people. So, for example, you can think one of the projects, AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, whereby we're saying that, intra-African trade is at most like 15%. So we trade within ourselves as Africans only at 15%. So we still trade more. So we still have those colonial patterns whereby we still trade more with the colonial powers, So for example, you'd find countries, for example, in West Africa still trading much, with your likes of France, for example, you think of SADC and then you think about the role of Britain. And now I can say by extension, the European Union, looking at how actually it has gained that footprint in the South. So you can actually see those patterns, but to say, in this moment, what then are we thinking about? So, for example, the implementation of the AfCFTA, how are we going to think about it with this ambition of this big single markets of the African people with over 1 billion people that are going to be participating on it? We also think of what I call strategic alignment, So countries such as South Africa have joined BRICS. At the time it was still BRIC, and then we joined, and then it was called BRICS. And you think about that from a strategic alignment perspective, from South cooperation, whereby you see ourselves, you see us aligning with these global powers such as your China, such as your Russia, your India as well, which are good emerging economies, as well as Brazil. So you see that there is an approach that we've also taken, and you know that, for example, the likes of Ethiopia have also joined into this bloc. The likes of Egypt as well have also joined into this bloc, as well as the countries in the Middle East. So you can see that there's been two approaches to this, to say, obviously, we cannot, I think there is a view actually from Africa to say that we don't think that we can actually proactively take an approach into what is going to be the future, of multilateralism, but rather let us be in favorable conditions than we were at the moment. Because if you think from the side, for example, of how we've been handling debt, and I think there is a big question actually since it's the G20, the question that is going to be addressed by heads of states, which actually they've been addressing, throughout the year together with their Minister of Finances and stuff like that. It's a question of debt. How exactly are going to handle the issue of debt in Africa, So it's a really, fascinating moment for us. But I do see it as an opportunity to say, how then are we going to strategically align ourselves in making sure that the outcome of the future, it is much better favorable to us, because my own personal reflection, I don't think that Africa has a single position whereby you're going to say, as Africa, this is our voice and this is what we are thinking about in terms of how the world should actually look like. I mean, if you look, for example, the voting patterns in the United Nations General Assembly, they simply tell you, you don't have something that is very exactly. So
So I mean, speaking on these strategic alignments, like I'm thinking of a statement that the former international relations minister here in South Africa, Dr. Naledi Pan, says that, well, with all these things, with the BRICS, with all these other organizations and alignments that they're trying to pursue, the multilateral system is still the goal, and it must be upheld. But I'm really kind of like, I want us to enter that, because at the same time as it is crumbling, you're also seeing these like wild protests that are emerging from the global south here. Just now in Madagascar, we saw a military intervention. In Nepal. So you're seeing this kind of like struggles from below, at the same time as the global governance is kind of like seems to be shifting. I don't know what could we take from this? What could be the signals that we could take from that?
Now, for me, I can say one thing: we cannot think of multilateralism outside of democracy. I don't think that is possible. And hence, even the pursuit from global south countries, it's to say democratize these institutions, democratize United Nations Security Council. You cannot have an agenda which since 1945 until now, almost 80% of the agenda has always been about African issues. But we don't have a single African country that is permanently represented in the Security Council. It says democratize the voting pattern in the IMF. If you look at the people that are actually borrowing funds from the IMF, most of these states are usually Latin American as well as African states. But look at their voting rights, in the IMF as well as the World Bank. And actually, there is a meeting, that is ongoing until Saturday at IMF. and World Bank. So I would be glad to see what are going to be the outcomes of those particular meetings. But now to link that to what we've been seeing with this rise of protests. So, for example, you'll remember the regressive bill that was being tried to push in Kenya. You saw the Gen Z protests in Kenya.
Yeah.
You saw Madagascar. You saw Nepal last month. I can say that these are the demands of the people. End of the day, multilateralism, it is about global cooperation, and it is about representation of states, in the multilateral system, so in this world system. However, the gains from there, they must reflect on the ground.
Yeah.
So now what we are seeing happening is that firstly, we are not represented there adequately. But number two, we are not seeing the proper the benefits, of why are we even part of these things. I mean, I've had to defend the G20 so many times. Why are we even wasting so much money hosting the G20? What exactly is the point of this? Because people, I like this quote by Amilcar Cabral, when he speaks about the fact that people are not fighting for ideas and everything. People are fighting to live in peace, to defeat poverty, and to see a future for their children. That is the basic end of the day. They don't matter about the ideology and all of those kind of things. So now what we are seeing happening is that, and particularly when you think about how then democracy came, into Africa, and I'm just going to speak about the contemporary period because it has been something in the making for a very long time. But just to speak about the contemporary period, when from the 1970s moving until now, for example, you think about the oil crisis that happened in the 1970s, you see African states being in debt. And that is where I can say that actually that is where the contemporary problem that we're actually facing on the debt question, it's where it comes from. So you see countries, for example, now, I mean, if you look at the liberation movement, they were on the left, almost all of them in Africa. They had this leftist politics, all of those kind of things. But after that 1970s oil crisis, their policies did no longer address the needs of the people. You see. So now what happens after? You then have the debt relief to say, but they came in packaging, to say, adopt these policies which were strategically aligned with Washington consensus, which is strategically aligned also with liberal democracy, to say, accept 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and we are going to release you from that to a particular extent, of course. And you saw then those tensions coming down and everything. But the thing is, you never solved the problems of inequality, the problems of high unemployment in countries and everything, which is what the people are actually concerned about. They're not concerned about your power in terms of being able to shift power in the United Nations, all of those kind of things. They don't care about that. People really care about what exactly affects me now and how I'm going to address these particular things. So now, for example, if you look at the likes of Madagascar, you look at the likes of Kenya, for example, whereby we saw austerity, being implemented, we saw austerity being implemented live. We saw those particular protests. We saw how people responded. Actually, in South Africa, we actually nearly had that moment. If you'll remember the policy paper that was, it wasn't a policy paper, it was a gazette that was released by the DTIC, I think a month or two ago, about auctioning student debts to...
Yes. I remember that.
Exactly. You see, if you remember that moment, I can, and we can always speak about also the process of democratization into why then South Africa were able to actually do a lot of lobbying as young people on Twitter, all of those kind of things to say right against this particular bill and make sure that it doesn't pass. And actually, I'm glad that the minister listened and he reversed that particular gazette. But to say that in other countries whereby you don't see too much democratization, being in a state, usually there is going to show in the forms of protest. There is going to show in the forms of rebellion. So, for example, one concept, that I always accept about democratizing a country is that you have a democratic transition, So, for example, it can move from either a fascist rule to a democratic rule. You can move from authoritarian rule to a democratic rule. Like, that is a transition. Number two, you see, so just on that step, then that's where then you see, for example, now the creation of institutions. So, for example, the Constitution, the creation of, in the South African context, we can use the Chapter 9 institutions. So, for example, your SA, Human Rights Commission, all of those, Public Protector's Office, you see all of those kind of things. These are the institutions, which are created in that phase. And then you have the second phase, which is deepening, democratic deepening. So now, there is where now you extend civil liberties, voting, knowing also that it doesn't end with voting, but you're actually able to influence laws that are being made in Parliament. government, because, for example, if there is to be a citizen law that is going to be passed, there's usually public participation. And you saw, for example, this example that I just made, in relation to that student debt review, that was by the DTIC minister, and actually our participation in that. But the thing is, now we have this democratic consolidation now, which is the final phase, then, to make sure that now, no matter who is in power, no matter which party is in power, we do not regress back to other forms of regimes. So I can say that also, if you look then at the stages of democratization in these other countries, there hasn't really been this aspect whereby you can see public participation, especially through civil society, whereby you can say we are going to be able to argue on these 1, 2, 3 issues, where we do not see full media freedom, so that people do know what is happening in the country. Because, for example, if you're in the rural areas and you don't even know the policies that are going to affect you, you're not going to be able to participate in the democratic process other than voting, because there is usually the thing that is on our faces that in a democracy, your role is to vote, make sure that you have a representative. But that is it. But the thing, it doesn't end there. You see. So what you can see then as a trend is that what you've seen, for example, in the likes of Madagascar recently, the likes of Nepal, the likes of Indonesia, the likes of Kenya, is the fact that there is still that element that is still missing, of democratic deepening, whereby we are going to see the full participation of people and also their demands being met.
You know what I'm getting from your comment right now is that regardless of all these things, I mean, these pitfalls, these shortfalls, democracy is still the goal. It is still what we should kind of like aspire to. But I'm trying to think about it also in relation to how, at the same time as we are pursuing these democratic regimes, there's deepening poverty, there's deepening unemployment, there's deepening, and as a result, you're having this upsurge in these extremist nationalist movements that are just like springing up everywhere. And these things are happening all at once. I don't know, how could we look into that, deepen democracy, but also attend to these urgent questions of unemployment, of poverty, and all these other illnesses that emerge?
Maybe I'm going to be controversial.
It's okay.
I always make an argument that perhaps liberal democracy isn't something that people want, but we have never experimented with other forms of democracy.
Okay.
And I'm saying this because there isn't one single form of democracy is liberal democracy. We have social democracy, and then if you look at the ethos and the values of what social democracy is, it isn't something that we have actually explored in South Africa.
Yeah.
So now what happens with liberal democracy is that, as I just made an example earlier on about how then, for example, democracy was then accepted by African states, all of those kind of things, shifting from those leftist socialist policies, into market-oriented oil policies. So one argument that one can make from that observation is that perhaps you cannot look at democracy and try to divorce it from the market, the capitalist system as it is today. I don't think that is possible. They exist, as partners. Yeah, they exist as partners. And obviously, with the historical problem that the continent faces, the problems of, for example, of spatial development, for example, in the South African context, you think about the segregation, of people from their rural areas as well as cities, whereby people are going to be able to find jobs. One argument then you can make is the fact that I don't think you can then make an argument. Sorry, I don't think that then liberal democracy is the right approach to our problems. And I'm saying this because, I've been interested much, in the works of people who study social democracy, how it is, what are the ethos and everything. And perhaps for me, I always made an argument that perhaps if we can have such a system, because now what we are seeing, I don't think these are the failures of democracy. I think this is just a byproduct of a liberal democracy. So the failure to attend to these issues of high unemployment, because, for example, it links directly to what the market wants in terms of not government spending. make sure that you cut government spending. But then you ask yourself, how then are you going to help someone who's deep in the rural areas, deep in the township? How are you going to assist them in actually getting that kid, to go to university? You're going to need government spending in terms of building schools. You're going to need government spending in terms of making sure that there's funding for the university fees, all of those kind of things. You see. But the thing is, with these civil liberties, political rights, they intertwine with what the market want in terms of like the capitalist ethos, which is really about removing, social spending, to say no, remove social spending. We've heard those arguments in South Africa saying no, the debt is getting too high, we are bloating the government expenditure. You see all of those kind of things. So, and obviously what is going to happen is that now when you obviously give in into those ideas, what is going to happen is that we are going to see the grassroots movements obviously shaping, reshaping what are they saying and saying, no, we can't do this. But also one thing now, which then gets dangerous, Samukelo, here, is the fact that when that happens, you often see extremism rising. You often see shifting the blame, rather than what exactly is the problem, but rather shifting the blame now to it could be in the form of xenophobia, it could be in the form of tribalism, so on and so forth. But you do see those particular ideas actually growing. And you can say that these now become a product of what the people are facing. And then if you have a charismatic populist leader who is going to be able to articulate properly what exactly are your issues, you are going to rally behind that particular person. But I don't necessarily believe that that is exactly what they want. But I think the conditions, and also now with the system that we're existing in, having that populist leader who's going to be able to use your problems to parade them and say, but these are the issues that people are facing. We're having the problem of unemployment because of foreigners, all of those things. You see, then people will obviously turn to that as a solution, because the solution that was given to them at first didn't work out for them. So,
I mean, thinking of these extremist movements and also because what becomes more obvious, and here I'm trying to think with the Sahel region, for instance, particularly in how democracy there has not really addressed the question of foreign influence and how then that lends itself to questions of peace and security, but also of these movements that emerge. And so that whole idea that democracy in Africa still has not solved the question of foreign influence. I don't know. Do you want to maybe like speak into that? Because there is this idea that, well, when you democratize, then you will take, you will heed to the voices of the people, but it doesn't seem to be the case.
No, in reality, in practical, I think in theory, people do argue that no, that would be the case. You're removing the influence, and then the people will have their voice. As you say, for example, democracy in intando yeningi is the will of the people. But then in reality, when you think then about liberal democracy and also the values, from how then society should be organized, from the economic perspective, you then get to see that it is sort of impossible for you to simply say just because you've democratized and then it means the only will, that will govern society is going to be the will of the people. I mean, if you do have people that have huge influence, obviously there is one key factor to say, if you have one individual that is able to dictate how policies should actually, how policies should be shaped in government. And then you cannot say that just because you have democracy, then those particular individuals no longer have a voice. No, they do. And that's why you have these things of lobbying, all of those kind of things. It's a reality. People lobby with resources, and you have resources because there's a market in order for you to get those particular resources, and you lobby for your particular interest. So we never solved, obviously, the question of how then about these ultra wealthy people in society who are able to lobby for certain policies. I mean, the whole lobby group thing, it is because of that, So I can make an argument that democracy doesn't mean that you are going to remove the influence, foreign influence or even influence from internal, but something that is not coming from the will of the people, but something that is desired by very few people in society. But obviously now what happens is that you are going to slide back, to forms of benevolent dictatorships, authoritarianism. You see all of those kind of things to say, maybe we need a leader who's just going to be firm and do things right.
Yeah.
We've heard those arguments. I think, when you're also on Twitter and then you see how people are actually so tired, of the thing that are happening in South Africa.
Paul Kagame.
Yeah, you need a Paul Kagame of some sort. You need a Ibrahim Traore, who's just going to be firm and not listen, just do things, and unfortunately, that is very dangerous, But we cannot just shut those arguments down to say, but you must actually try and address the issues. Why exactly are now people suddenly willing to give away certain freedoms for a sense of security? Because that is usually the basis.
Yeah.
There's usually an argument. I remember actually that even when I used to be a student, I remember, I think it was my first or second year, when we were actually just doing a case study of Rwanda post the genocide, the rise of Kagame, all of those kind of things. Yeah. And then I did hear a lot of arguments saying that, no, I'd rather not have, a right for me to actually say, no, the government is doing nonsense. As long as I'm promised that after this degree, I'm going to have a job. Just as much as I know that, no, after this, at least I'm secure. So people look for that sense of security. And it's come to a point whereby people are actually willing to trade their liberties for it. Which is something that is very dangerous.
Yeah. And it's interesting, actually, like picking up this exchange that we are willing to make now, that we are actually willing to exchange some certain liberties and accept a benevolent dictator as long as we can have some jobs, as long as we can have stable electricity. I don't know what exactly, and in another episode actually we spoke about freedoms and unfreedoms and what freedom actually looks like in that sense. I don't know. I'm not going to pose that question to you. To think about freedom, but I do want to hear. Your reflections on this whole African solutions for African problems things, because at the same time as we are thinking about these questions of freedoms, benevolent dictators, and exchanging some certain rights as long as we can have some jobs, some stable economies, there's also a question of finding some grounded solutions to Africa's unique problems. Are they really unique? Is this idea of African solutions for African problems still really relevant in this moment?
African solutions for African problems, it seems like now it's just some buzzword, that has been used over decades, but we haven't really seen what were the outcomes of it. I can't think of events whereby we have seen African solutions, African problems, in the African context. What I've rather seen, it's the abuse of that particular term, and even by liberals, by the way. They've abused that particular term. So, for example, if you think about the transition in South Africa, we didn't hold people accountable. You had a TRC, and then we said, in the spirit of Ubuntu and all of those kind of things, we should try to reconcile with people, and we should actually create this particular society so that we prevent your civil wars and stuff like that. So we didn't want to be this other African country after independence, whereby now you're going to be ravaged by wars and conflicts all over. So the African solution to African problems concept, for me, it is a question of how unique are these problems to Africa? So, for example, if you can think from the security side, peace and security, it isn't something that is very unique to Africa. It is something that even other countries have been faced with. But obviously, what we can argue is that what necessitates those particular conflicts is then very important. So, for example, if you just understand and study the conflicts around the African continent, you'll see that most of them are actually a product of colonialism, and by simple thing of dividing a border. You see, dividing like a country whereby now this was one people at a point, you are dividing it. just putting a fence, and then you are saying now these are two different people, two different nationalities, but these are people who share the same species. These are people who share the same resources. Maybe you are this side and your grandfather's grave is on the other side. You see all of those kind of things. I think even in my area where I'm coming from, you are still having those struggles even today, actually, whereby we are trying to, okay, where does this place actually belong to? Is it part of, or you see all of those kind of things. But also in a wider context, like in the African context, you think about, for example, in countries whereby now it's really about borders to say, and we've seen actually a lot of like independence, for example, South Sudan, being formed as a state. You see Djibouti, you see Somaliland, all of those kind of things. And then you get to see that actually the concept is very much important, but in terms of application, I don't know how relevant it has been, because I always go to the side of how do we make this thing work in practice. And if you think about the practice of these things, the funders are very much questionable. So for example, you've seen the role of the European Union, in funding those in funding those particular problems, to say, okay, this could be the solution. But for a fact that there's no funding that comes without any packages of conditions. We know the argument that has been made against AFRICOM, which is led by the US, and its role exactly in Africa. Is it really progressive? Really, exactly. You see all of those kind of things. So the application for me has always been a problem, that in context, this thing is very much important, and in concept also, it is very much important. But in terms of practice, we are not able to get resources ourselves as Africans. So gather resources ourselves as Africans and say this could be a solution. I mean, even the African Union itself, you look at the funding patterns of the African Union, firstly from the building, which was built by the Chinese. Number two, about the operations of the African Union on a day-to-day basis, largely dependent on the European and Chinese funding, with very few contributions actually that are coming from the African continent. But at the same time, you're saying you're championing, that the African interest. And this goes back to the argument that I made earlier on, and then to say, these things play out in the global context. For example, the voting pattern that you see in the United Nations General Assembly, whereby now we should say this should be our position as Africa. I mean, let me make an example actually as I'm going to that. I think 3 or 4 months back, actually, countries such as Ethiopia and Egypt pushed back when there was a recommendation earlier this year by Brazil, which was hosting the BRICS presidency, to say, in our push for the Security Council reform, South Africa should be the African country that represents Africa there. And then obviously you saw a pushback, from the likes of Egypt, because I mean now they are part of the BRICS. The likes of Ethiopia as well pushing back to that, to say no, but there's a Zulu consensus which speaks about those particular things and everything. So the argument here that I'm making is that even if now we have to go to the global stage, you don't find common ground, to say, because surely we haven't even discussed in this Azulini consensus, how then are we going to contextualize this within how the chair is being elected in the Security Councils, for example, you see being a permanent member, all of those kind of things. I digress. But just to come back to the thing, it was just to make an example that in terms of the problems that we're actually facing, because usually that phrase is usually used a lot, in terms of conflict, actually, whereby you say, no, we cannot allow external actors, which by principle is okay, and I do applaud it, actually, by principle, that no, we should actually try to find a solution to say, no, but ourselves as African, and particularly with this African, in this African context, this is how we should be solving this particular thing. You can think of the cases of Rwanda after the genocide. They have this, I forgot the name of the courts which they had, but they didn't have these normal court proceedings, like the modern court proceedings, which they dealt it with in their context, as the people of Rwanda, to say, if there's been an issue, for example, in the family or in the community, for us, this is usually how we come and resolve the issue, So, that is usually how we think about African problems and African solutions. But in terms of the implementation of it, we've been really lacking on that one.
Well, I mean, and I'm glad you're pointing it out, because there's still also that idea of protecting each other. I mean, many of these older African presidents, I mean, in Cameroon right now, you had like what? How old was it? 90 or something? 90 something.
So yeah.
And he was still campaigning for the 8th term and probably couldn't even walk. And I mean, the same thing was happening in Uganda, like a candidate who's visibly sick. And so these are people who still sit in these things and who still push for these African solutions for African problems. And I think you're right to point out that on paper, it sounds like a good thing, but in reality, there isn't much implementation. Now, as a way out, I just want to hear your thoughts on the possibilities of democratizing these global institutions and the multilateral system, but also looking at how democratizing these things as part of also deepening democracies within the national context. Is it possible? And what are the visions of the organization that you represent? I mean, the South African Youth Association for Global Affairs. I mean, what are your visions around democratizing the global institutions?
Well, you cannot think about Africa's future and you leave the youth behind. That is usually our approach. And when we go and talk to people, that is what you usually say. And you expand further on there to say, the African continent, by 2050, over 65% of it, according to the statistics, will be of people that are actually younger than 25. So this possesses a threat, but also a lot of opportunities. It is a threat if we are going to the next 10 years without seeing the full participation of young people. It is going to be a threat if we are not going to see young people not being passive audience, but rather being active citizenry, in all contexts, from the national context up to the global context. And we usually make our basis on the Security Council resolution, which is Resolution 2250, which speaks about how should we support youth participation in global affairs from the ground until global context. We speak about representation, which is one of the most important things, about reform of institutions to make sure that young people are represented. But we also do take responsibility to say, we are not going to go to the table and say, please include us. Have initiatives. But what is going to happen now is the fact that if you are not able to cater for the needs of those young people, what we've seen in Madagascar, what we have seen in Nepal, what we have seen in Kenya is not immune to South Africa. And it isn't immune to the whole African continent. And I made a point earlier on about when democracies are being challenged because now they are not able to deliver on their promises, extremism rises, populism rises, and now imagine a youthful continent that is going to align with those ideas, that is going to align with those ideologies, that is going to be easily manipulated by those actors, both internal and external. It is going to pose a serious security threat for the continent. And there is our view to say that you must arrest the issue before you even say it. So you must be able to say, as SAYAGA, this is what we are representing, and these are the deliverables that we have seen. You see, and if we're unable to do that, even us who say we are civil society, we push for youth, all of those kind of things, we are going to be victims.
Yeah.
You see, we are going to be victims of that. But there are huge opportunities on the bright side also. If we are able to make sure the youth we are not asking for too many things, as a youth. The youth is not asking for too many things. People want insurance that when I'm going to have an opportunity to go to school. I'm going to have an opportunity to get a job. I'm going to have an opportunity to imagine what it means to be an African in the African context, to imagine what it is to be black in the world, to imagine all of those kind of things, and actually having the space and freedom to do those things. And now that opens another kind of worms about the role of education in decolonization, all of those kind of things. But it's just within those contexts what I'm speaking about. So if you are able to afford these opportunities to people, and then we can see the great coming out of this continent. But if you're not able to deliver on those promises, what happened in the Sahel is not immune to South Africa. It is not immune to the whole Southern Africa. And actually, there was a conference by liberation movements. Can't remember which month, but this year, and I think you've seen the decline of the liberation movements, across SADC. Actually, we've seen the loss of power, of liberation movement from South Africa, from to Botswana. You see, all over SADC, you have seen the rejection, of the liberation movements. Perhaps now, those who are in the political sphere, it's time to think, what exactly is are young people concerned about today? You see, we have one thing when you say this is what we imagine what the people want versus what exactly the people want, and we should actually study also the outcomes. The outcomes of the election? Oh, okay. If you are seeing this particular pattern, what exactly were these people saying, and why are young people? If we can just study young people alone, why alone young people? Those who are not voting are not voting. Why those who voted for this particular movements, you see. If you're able to study that enough, we are going to be able to actually start creating policies that are going to address those needs that people are looking for. But just from face value, everyone, who particularly from some of us who come from rural areas and townships, the moment you go to an institution, one thing that you want is that after this institution, I need to get a job.
Yeah.
I need to be able to go and support my family. I need to be able to just make a better life for myself and also for my family. It's a question of dignity that we don't want poverty. That is it. So then the question becomes, how then do you address those things? And I think the political class as a whole knows how to address that particular question. Maybe the question is there a political will to do so? And if there isn't any political will, what is going to happen? And I'm saying again that what happened in other sections of the world is not immune to us. The youth unemployment crisis in South Africa, you cannot suppress it for a very long time. Around 62% of young people are not able to get jobs in South Africa. You see, which are scary statistics. The deepening inequality levels, and I spent a lot of time actually studying inequality. Different types of inequality. I didn't even know you have different types, because usually when you think about inequalities, you just think about the economic divide between people. That the rich is too rich, the poor are too poor. You see, you just see that economic divide. But then it goes further also to social inequality now, which now speaks exactly to as a person about what makes me dignified as a person. It goes further to those particular options. To those particular sections to say what exactly makes me a human, in this world, and what is going to happen also if we are not, if the cluster that is being entrusted with delivering, on these particular issues is not able to deliver. What is then going to happen? And I can say that with the populism on the rise, with extremism on the rise, nationalism really rising as well, it is much easier then for people to start identifying other external actors to say, no, we have too many foreigners in South Africa. It's because of them that you don't have jobs. But you don't actually study this thing further, but to say, who then employs the foreign nationals that don't have the documents to come to South Africa? And then you're going to understand that, no, it is the capitalist class And then why is the capitalist class doing so? It is because of exploitation. Because for you as a South African, you're already covered with labor laws of this country, with unions, all of those kind of things. But it's much easier to exploit the labor of someone who really needs to see that 100 rand at the end of the day. But for you as a South African, because of having all of those protections, they will strategically make sure that they do not include you, in terms of job opportunities, all of those kind of things. So it's all of those kind of things that we shouldn't just think about this question just on a face value, but we should actually always think beyond that and actually think what exactly should be the solutions.
Well, we end on that note. Thank you so much for joining this episode. Remember to like, to share, and to subscribe. Thank you.